Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, on a mission to create remodeling experiences worthy of 5-star online reviews. See the difference at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. We're going to spend this hour with writer and translator Jhumpa Lahiri. The celebrated author's debut collection of short stories, Interpreter of Maladies, won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the PEN Hemingway Award in 2000. Lahiri has been a finalist for the Booker Prize and the National Book Award, and her work has been recognized with the National Humanities Medal and Guggenheim Foundation Fellowships. Lahiri is adding another honor to this illustrious list, the 2026 St. Louis Literary Award. She'll be in St. Louis next Wednesday to receive it. I got a chance to talk with Jhumpa Lahiri a few days ago, and we started our conversation by talking about her upbringing. I noted that place has played a major role in her life and work. Her parents moved from Kolkata, India to London, England, where she was born. The family made their way to Cambridge, Massachusetts, before settling down in South Kingston, Rhode Island. And I asked Lahiri how growing up in an immigrant family there in the 1970s shaped her early life and perspectives.
I think it was, how can I say this? I mean, it utterly shaped my life and all of my perspectives. I mean, it was the only reality that I knew. I was raised in a very specific reality, one in which home was not the house we were inhabiting. The sense of emotional home for my parents was not contained within the walls that surrounded us in the here and now. So I was very much living in two spaces, the sort of the day-to-day surroundings and that other place, that faraway place that remained the point of reference for so many things. So that was how I grew up. That was how I was raised, and I really didn't know any other way of being or thinking about things or approaching things.
And was going to school a significant part of your coming to that realization?
Yeah, I mean, I think going to school, well, first of all, going to school was very traumatic for me because I didn't speak English. And so, that was, it was not only a separation from my parents, and I think, as a mother, I can say, having lived this from the point of view of a parent, I think most children, not all, but many children struggle with that first step outside of the household and your parents, being in your parents' world and under their wing. But in my case, that was complicated because I didn't speak English and I wasn't used to people speaking English to me. And so there was a double, two levels of difficulty in getting used to that. And then I think, because my school life was conducted entirely in English, then the awareness of the two languages became quickly evident, and the need to be somehow fluent in both became very clear at an age when I was, far too young to sort of make sense of any of all of this. But it was certainly happening and informing the young person that I was.
Was there something that made facing and, perhaps if overcoming is the right way to put it, that was key in overcoming those challenges you've described?
I think that my solution was to, or my strategy was to find what we now call the third space, right? And that was reading and the space of books and words and stories, and the that private, silent space that was nevertheless very much alive with speaking. The voices I heard in my head when I read books, right? I think that was where I gravitated. I gravitated toward that space of the written word.
Were there certain books or authors that you gravitated toward, particularly when you were a teenager before going off to college?
A teenager. Well, I was interested in. I think I was interested in a lot of European literature, actually, as a teenager. I read Anna Karenina, and I discovered Hardy. I discovered Thomas Hardy, who remains a very important author for me. And I thought a lot about what it meant to be an outsider, thanks to Hardy and his works. I was interested in French authors. I was interested in, poetry, French poetry, all sorts of. I was searching for things that were sort of outside of my reality, I think. At the same time, I discovered as a teenager, I read in school. I read Melville. I read Hawthorne. I read Fitzgerald. I read American authors, right, as well, and who spoke to me very much. But it never felt. They both spoke to me, but I also always felt that they were also foreign, right, because I was raised with the idea that I wasn't an American. And so I never felt American. And so, it took me a long time to realize the fact that, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville were, lived in more or less the same geographical reality that I, that we all grew up in that same setting, and, that same land, that same ocean. That never registered to me when I was a teenager. The world of those authors felt just as foreign as any other world, really. I think the takeaway, shall we say, of my experience growing up was that I had no place to call my own. And that has really remained, in some sense, the case, but with a slightly different slant now that I'm an adult.
Mm-hmm. And was that what compelled you then to decide to write yourself?
It's really not a decision. I never think of it as a decision, even though I understand there's a lot of action required in sitting down to write something. But I think because it began so early for me, the idea of sitting down with pen and paper, sitting down with my thoughts, trying to listen to myself, trying to hear myself think, trying to put things into words, trying to put things into words. This was an activity that started for me very early on. And, I think it started in a moment in which I still wasn't terribly confident as a speaker of English. And I think most of the communication, the important communication in my life, was still being very much conducted in Bengali. And so it was always there as a habit, right? And so there was never a moment when I thought, okay, I'm going to strike out and do this thing. I was always doing it. I was always doing it in some way. I think what happened over time was that it became more and more central to my life, and it took over more and more time and energy. And then I realized that this habit that I had had ever since I was, 6 or 7 years old, was actually going to had turned into my calling.
I'm talking with Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Jhumpa Lahiri. She will receive the 2026 St. Louis Literary Award next week. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue my conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. Let's return to my conversation with Jhumpa Lahiri. The celebrated writer will receive the St. Louis Literary Award next week. The honor is presented annually by the St. Louis University Libraries. Tickets for the ceremony at the Sheldon are available now. At that event, Jhumpa Lahiri will accept the award and talk about her life and career. So, Jhumpa, in 1999, that was when Interpreter of Maladies was published, and it was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and Penn Hemingway Award the year after. An Interpreter of Maladies is a collection of 9 short stories about Indians and Indian Americans who are navigating love, detachment, identity, immigration, cultural expectations. So you've said that you started writing not as a decision, but as a vocation, as a calling. Did you do that in part through Interpreter of Maladies because there was something that you wanted other people to read?
I think that I graduated from college and I was 21 and I was confused. I didn't know what to do next or where to go. And, there were expectations that I would go on to earn higher degrees and maybe get a job as a university professor. This was sort of the reality that I knew. My father worked in a university as a librarian for most of his life, and I knew a lot of people who worked in universities. I grew up in a university town. So this was sort of the general direction that life seemed to be pointing toward, and it was in those years, I think, after graduating from college and not having immediately something specific to do, right? It was in that period of sort of this in-between period, shall we say, of exploring for the first time, exploring what did I want to do with my life, with my time. What did I want to do with my time? And in that period, and I had a job and I had this job and that job, and I was taking some courses and, as I said, exploring. But I think in that time, it was clear what I was putting my energy into on, Friday night, Saturday night, when I didn't have plans, when I didn't have anything else going on, when I was alone, and sort of how to deal with being alone, how to deal with the time I had on my own. It was clear to me, it became increasingly clear to me in that period that what I preferred to do was to sit alone and think about, think about life, try to make sense of it in my way. And that took the form of writing.
So it sounds almost as though the stories that you wrote were companions of a sort. When you first started writing the stories that are in Interpreter of Maladies, did you imagine them as a collection, or did that come at some other point as you were in the writing process?
Much later. I never thought I would. When I was writing those stories, I never thought I would. I never thought they would become a book. I never thought I would become a writer. I was writing them, and I was increasingly attracted to the idea of improving as a writer. That was all I really was concerned about, because I felt an inclination to write. I loved literature. I loved short stories. I loved novels. I loved poetry. These things had, literature had sustained me, continues to sustain me, my entire life. And so it was where I felt at home. Okay, so to go back to that question of, what was it like for me to grow up? Well, to grow up the way I did made me aware that I didn't have any specific place to call home, but literature was that place, and literature did not question where I was from, right? A book never asked me where I was from, where was I really from? A book never bothered me with those questions. A book let me open it and read it and know it and engage with it without those questions. And that was the only place in my life where I was free of those questions, was inside of the space of a book. And so I was writing these stories. I started writing, shall we say, in my 20s after college. The stories in the beginning were confused and needed a lot of work, and I wanted to get better. And so that set me on a path, right, of trying to get better, and that meant taking classes, and that meant sharing my work with some trusted people who would read my 2 or 3 pages and give me some sort of feedback. And these were crucial exchanges in that early phase. Someone would read something that I had written or tried to write. I would read something that she had written or tried to write. We would talk about these fledgling projects and what was working, what wasn't working. And so these early exchanges led to my taking a creative writing workshop at Boston University. And then that led to my applying to be in the, master's program in creative writing 1 year at Boston University, and working with Leslie Epstein and Aaron Appelfeld and other writers who were now reading my fledgling attempts, right, and giving me feedback, giving me their feedback on what was working, what was not working. So it was this sort of ongoing wish to become a better writer for myself, for my own satisfaction, to feel that I was learning how to build something sturdy, something stable, something that could hold up, as it were, right, on the page. And so in this period of learning, and I'm still in it, right? I should say I'm still very much in it. But in that first period of learning, I began writing those stories, some of them for my classes, my classmates, others on my own. A few of them were published by literary magazines over time, not immediately. But then at one point I realized that, because I went on to get my PhD, right? So I spent a year sort of focused on writing short stories, but I immediately went on to get a PhD, and I was no longer focused on the story writing in the same way. I couldn't be, because I had academic work that was taking precedence. But what occurred to me after another, some years had passed, was that the short stories had also accumulated, and that there were enough of them to think about, possibly putting together maybe into a book. And and because I had then gotten to know some other writers, right? Some other writers who were starting out, and I saw what was happening with them, and they were putting together their own collections or their first novel or what have you. And so, it was all part of a process of seeing what was possible. I certainly wasn't expecting any of it.
Something that struck me is that the majority of stories in Interpreter of Maladies take place in the U.S., in New England or the East Coast, and then 3 are set in India. In the book, the characters' speech and thoughts are written in English. As the people in your stories, Jhumpa, came alive in your imagination, what languages did you hear? And how did you go about expressing that on the page?
Well, I had to translate, because they were speaking another language. They were not speaking English. Most of them were not speaking English. So, most of those stories contain, and I've written about this, right, contain very much an element of translation. And I, because English was the only language I knew how to write in at that point, that was the only solution to make the story function for someone reading me in English, let's say a friend or a classmate or a teacher, what have you. And I thought once in a while I would insert a Bengali word or an expression. I remember in those earlier stories, I was looking for models, right? So I would look at what other writers had done, right? How other writers had worked with, a story written in English that's set in India, or set in a Spanish language speaking place, or French, or whatever. I was so new to all of this that I wasn't thinking things through in any comprehensive way. I was really fumbling through much of that time, and much of that collection was an act of fumbling, exploring, figuring out something to do in one story, and using that to write the next story, and trying not to make the same mistakes as, the things that I didn't like in one story, trying not to make those, trying to turn the corners a different way. I mean, that whole book was my, it was that. It was the very early apprenticeship work.
That's Jhumpa Lahiri. The Pulitzer Prize-winning writer is this year's recipient of the St. Louis Literary Award. Lahiri will be in St. Louis next Wednesday to accept the honor at a public ceremony at the Sheldon. After a quick break, we'll be back with more of my conversation with Lahiri. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
and Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. Let's return to my conversation with Jhumpa Lahiri. The celebrated writer will receive the St. Louis Literary Award next week. The honor is presented annually by the St. Louis University Libraries. Jhumpa Lahiri will accept the award and talk about her life and career at a dedicated event at the Sheldon. Tickets for that ceremony are available now. I spoke with Lahiri a few days ago in advance of her arrival in St. Louis. Our conversation included a question about why, in 2012, she decided to move to Rome, Italy, with her husband and children.
It was a combination of things. I think one was just the wish to be somewhere else, to live in a different place from the one that I knew best, the one in which I had been raised, i.e. the United States. It was the wish to expose our children, who were then quite young, to also to another reality and to explain to them what it meant to be foreign, because both my husband and I have, we lived our experiences of being and feeling foreign in different ways, but we spoke a common language in that sense, and we felt that was important to sort of, to pass down in a way to our children. I mean, I think some parents want the opposite, right? They don't want their children to ever feel that they don't fit in. But I felt, and I think my husband also, I mean, I don't want to speak too much for him, but, I felt strongly that it was important for our children to feel a little bit uncomfortable, actually, and not feel fully inserted into their reality. And at the same time, for me, another calling was the calling of Italian and the Italian language. And so I had been studying Italian, diligently enough in those years, kind of on and off, but then there was a kind of acceleration period. And I knew that if I didn't move to some part of Italy, that, I would never really get beyond a certain level of comprehension and fluency, which was I had before moving to Italy, but it was still at a very basic level of fluency. And so we moved here, for these various reasons, I suppose. But again, I mean, I think, the questions are very, very natural, sort of, when did you decide to be a writer? Why did you move to Italy? What people want to know, and I understand the kind of wanting to know the factors. But I have never really been a person who has thought rationally about the most important things in my life. They happened. They developed. Things went a certain way. It felt natural. It felt necessary. Right, so the move to Italy felt natural and necessary, even though it was not without its complications. But that was how it felt to me.
Did writing in Italian also come about as a natural process?
Yes and no, because I think that writing in a language that is quote unquote not your own is considered one of the most unnatural things, that a writer can do. It's viewed by most people with, deep suspicion. Why would you want to do that? Not your language. You don't belong there. You certainly don't belong there as a writer, right? So I was aware of both the unnaturalness of it, and yet for me something that felt very necessary and therefore organic, right, to my own, to myself and to my process and to what I needed creatively and existentially at that point in my life.
So, Jhumpa, we have been interviewing the recipients of the St. Louis Literary Award for the past decade, and we've usually done those events when the recipient is in town to receive the award. And we're talking with you in advance of your arrival here in St. Louis. But I'm curious about what you know of St. Louis and perhaps if there's something that you're looking forward to while you're in town here.
Well, I've never been there. I have a very good friend in Rome, actually, who is from St. Louis, and he grew up there. And but he's lived in Rome for at least 4 decades. And so most of what I know about St. Louis is through him, actually, and his stories about growing up there and his family. And so I've been curious about it because of this friendship. I also, it turns out I have some family there, an aunt, technically, one of my mother's cousins, second cousins, lives in St. Louis. And if I have some free time, I've heard about the museums and would like to make some time to visit them.
Mm-hmm. Jhumpa, there are some professors who write, who'd elect only to write rather than to teach alongside that. So you, as someone who does teach, you're constantly talking about writing and translating. What do you carry from those conversations into your work?
I think it's all part of a very generative ecosystem. And I think that as I am older, as I grow increasingly old, I feel that it's important, very important, to try to share with younger people, a new generation of human beings, a little bit of what I'm passionate about, not just me personally, but this whole cause of literature, right, of which I am, a member of the cause. And this has been my destiny, my role. I've devoted my life to reading, thinking about writing, thinking about authors, thinking about books, trying to write my own books. And I think that young people are always looking for meaning. We're all always looking for meaning, direction in life. Who are we? Why are we here? What are we doing? What binds us together? What drives us apart? These big questions, that literature has always been thinking about, interrogating, exploring. And so I feel that when I teach, it allows me to remember, rethink what it's all about. Why was it even so important? But then all it takes is to go back into the books, to remember that, as Mavis Gallant said, literature really is it's a question of life or death. It's that simple and that powerful. And for people who write and think about literature and read it and teach it, that is what it is. It's an existential condition. And so when I teach, I love preparing. I love going back. I love taking notes again. I love thinking about why I love this book or that book or this poet or, what have you. And I love I love seeing how it lands with people who have never heard of James Joyce or Dante or whomever, This is enlightening and important to also to not take for granted that, an author you think is really important, has been important to you, will necessarily resonate with someone who's 20 years old today, and to ask, sort of why is that, and what has changed, and is it the way I'm presenting the author? Is it just that the author is no longer speaking to this generation? Sort of asking constantly, or being open to the questions. I think the questions are the most important thing, not the answers that might, in the moment explain them. So I've learned so much from my students. I've been teaching for, I guess, a little over a decade now. But I also, I decided to make room for teaching alongside my writing later in my life for a very practical reason, and that was to liberate myself from the literary marketplace.
My last question here is, when you do meet with success, however you define that, what is the picture that we would have of Jhumpa Lahiri celebrating? How do you celebrate your wins?
I think the most meaningful and satisfying moments for me are the moments of completion of a project before it becomes, before it leaves my hands and becomes a book and makes its journey out into the world, into the hands of readers. So the most meaningful moments for me have always been, those warm pages of a first draft that come out of the printer that you put into an envelope, going to the library to read that first draft in a quiet place, and pulling out your pen and starting to make corrections immediately, but knowing that it's already kind of the book it's going to be. Maybe going out to dinner, with whomever, friends, my husband, to say, okay, so just the other day, for example, in Rome, give you an example. So I've been working for 5 years on a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses from Latin into English, working with a former colleague of mine at Princeton, a classicist named Yelena Baraz, and she and I have been working for 5 years to translate Ovid's great work into English, not for the first time, but for another time and for our time. And this has been one of the most important projects of my life, if not the most important project of my life. And Yelena came to Rome for about a week, and we had a deadline to meet, and we finished. We went through the entire translation. We went over all of our paratextual materials, the notes, the introductions, the comments, the so on and so forth. And we sat next to each other on the sofa and we pushed send. And that's the moment. Those are the moments that stay with me. And then the book comes out, and it is exciting. It's exciting to for it to be the book. It's exciting to have that first copy in your hands. But after that, the real satisfaction moves on to something else. And so then it becomes, I have a kind of split screen of, I'm excited for this translation to come out because it's been so meaningful to me, to both of us, I would say. But certainly speaking for myself, it's been such a meaningful project. So I'm on the one hand, I'm excited for it to become a book, and I can can teach it more easily, and I can talk about it, and I can go places, and I can talk about Ovid and why he's meant so much to me and why his work is so important for us to read and continue to read. But that satisfaction is secondary, I think, to the quieter, more private moments of feeling that one has come to the end of something and is ready to move on to something else.
Jhumpa, thank you so much for making time to talk with me today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your questions.
Jhumpa Lahiri is an award-winning author of several short story collections, novels, and essays. Her debut book, Interpreter of Maladies, won the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction in 2000. She is currently a professor of English and director of creative writing at Barnard College in New York City. Jhumpa Lahiri will receive the 2026 St. Louis Literary Award next Wednesday, April 8th at the Sheldon Concert Hall. The event begins at 7 p.m. For more information and tickets, visit thesheldon.org/events. Lahiri will also do an author craft talk next Thursday from noon to 1. It takes place at Cook Hall Auditorium on St. Louis University's main campus. This event is free with registration, and information is available at slu.edu/library.
This episode was produced by Elaine Cha. Edited by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.